May 5, 1945. The war in Europe was effectively over, though the paperwork had not yet caught up with the reality on the ground. Berlin had fallen. German resistance was collapsing into surrender and flight. In London, the British War Cabinet gathered not to celebrate, but to receive an order that ran against the public narrative of victory. The meeting took place in the War Office, away from press and ceremony. Present were the chiefs of staff, senior planners, and Winston Churchill himself. There was no preamble, no retrospective. Churchill spoke with deliberate precision. He instructed the Joint Planning Staff to prepare a military offensive against the Soviet Union. This was not framed as a contingency or an abstract exercise. It was an operational directive. The objective was explicit. Western Allied forces were to push the Red Army back from Central and Eastern Europe and compel Joseph Stalin to honor agreements made over Poland and the post-war settlement. The target date was fixed, July 1st, 1945, less than 8 weeks away. The room absorbed the order in silence. The scale was immediately apparent. The Soviet Union was no defeated enemy. The Red Army occupied a continuous front from the Baltic to the Balkans. It was the largest, most battle-hardened force on the continent. Yet Churchill did not hesitate. He instructed his chiefs to plan the attack as if it were going to be executed. Timetables, force ratios, logistics, political assumptions were to be set aside. Military reality was to be confronted directly. The chiefs of staff did not challenge the order. They did what they had been trained to do. They began calculating. They reviewed troop strengths. They assessed lines of communication. They examined the disposition of American and British divisions, many of which were already exhausted and preparing for redeployment. They compared those figures against Soviet strength and found the imbalance severe. Churchill remained unmoved. He pressed further. He authorized planners to consider measures previously unthinkable. Among them was the rearmament of selected German units that had only days earlier laid down their weapons. Up to 100,000 former Wehrmacht soldiers, familiar with Soviet tactics and terrain, could be returned to the field under Allied control. Their role would be instrumental, not symbolic. The operation was given a name: Operation Unthinkable. The title was not rhetorical. It reflected the magnitude of what had just been ordered. As the meeting ended, no one in the room believed the plan would be publicly defensible. No one believed it could remain secret if executed. But the directive stood. Days later, Churchill would stand on a balcony overlooking Whitehall, waving to cheering crowds as victory was declared. The country saw a war concluded. Inside the War Office, another had already been sketched into existence. In early May 1945, the military situation in Europe presented a narrow, fleeting opening that existed only on paper and only for a short time. This was the window Churchill believed could be exploited, and it was defined entirely by force disposition, momentum, and geography rather than ideology or rhetoric. The Red Army dominated the continent in raw numbers. Roughly 7 million Soviet soldiers stood in Europe, organized into approximately 170 divisions. They held uninterrupted lines from the Baltic Sea through Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and into the Balkans. Their formations were dense, their artillery concentrations heavy, their armored forces unmatched in scale. They had just taken Berlin at staggering cost and emerged with morale hardened rather than depleted. Supply lines ran eastward into territory already under Soviet control, protected by depth and redundancy built during 4 years of total war. Opposite them, the Western Allies possessed roughly 4 million men in theater, organized into 47 divisions. These forces were qualitatively strong, well-supplied, and operationally flexible, but they were thinner, more dispersed, and critically, exhausted. Many American units were already scheduled for redeployment to the Pacific. British forces were stretched between occupation duties, logistical reorganization, and demobilization pressures at home. The Western logistical system had been optimized for pursuit and occupation, not for launching a new continental war against a numerically superior opponent. Yet the opportunity Churchill perceived rested on timing rather than balance. Soviet forces, despite their strength, were extended. Their armies were deployed forward in occupation posture, not consolidated for defense against a Western attack. Rear area security units were thin. Command expectations assumed cooperation, not confrontation. The Red Army had not prepared contingency plans for immediate conflict with its former allies. Surprise, if achieved, would not be tactical but strategic. From a purely military standpoint, planners identified several theoretical avenues of action. A concentrated attack in northern Germany, using British and American armored forces, could attempt to rupture Soviet fronts before reserves could be shifted west. Air superiority, still firmly in Allied hands, offered the possibility of isolating Soviet spearheads and disrupting movement along rail and road networks. Airborne forces could seize key river crossings and logistics hubs, delaying Soviet reinforcement cycles. None of these options promised decisive victory. Their value lay in disruption. The goal was not the destruction of the Red Army, which was beyond Allied means, but the creation of sufficient pressure to force political negotiation. A limited rollback, even temporary, could alter leverage over Poland and Eastern Europe. That was the military logic underpinning the plan. The most controversial element of the opportunity was manpower. Churchill's willingness to consider rearming German soldiers stemmed from cold arithmetic, not sentiment. Over 2 million German troops were already in Allied custody. Among them were experienced formations with extensive knowledge of Soviet doctrine, operational tempo, and battlefield habits. Incorporating approximately 100,000 of these men into auxiliary or specialized roles could marginally reduce the numerical imbalance. They would not win the war, but they could complicate Soviet calculations at critical points. Planners understood the fragility of these assumptions. Every advantage depended on simultaneity. Surprise had to be complete. Weather had to cooperate. German units would need to be integrated without hesitation or resistance. Soviet command would need to react slower than it had demonstrated throughout the war. If any single factor failed, the entire operational concept unraveled. Even so, the opportunity existed long enough to be mapped. Western forces still occupied forward positions in Germany. Airfields, depots, and command infrastructure were intact and operational. Soviet forces were forward-leaning and not yet reorganized for a new enemy. July 1st represented the outer edge of plausibility. Beyond that date, demobilization, redeployment, and political normalization would close the window entirely. The planners' conclusion was stark. Militarily, an opportunity could be defined. It could be articulated. It could be costed. But it could not be guaranteed. The plan relied not on superiority, but on audacity, compression of time, and acceptance of catastrophic risk. The opportunity was real only in theory, and only for a moment. Churchill did not approach this decision impulsively. By the time the order was issued, his assessment of the Soviet Union had been formed over years of direct exposure, observation, and repeated frustration. What distinguished this moment was not alarm, but preparation. He believed the warning signs had already been ignored too long. His evaluation of Soviet intent was grounded in pattern recognition rather than conjecture. From Tehran onward, he had tracked a consistent sequence, promises made under pressure, followed by unilateral reinterpretation once Soviet forces occupied territory. Poland was not an abstract concern. Britain had entered the war over Polish sovereignty, and Churchill regarded its fate as a direct measure of Allied credibility. By May 1945, Red Army control over Eastern Europe was no longer provisional. It was being institutionalized. Churchill's warning to his planners was therefore framed as a narrowing timeline. He argued that leverage existed only while Western armies still stood deep inside Germany with their supply systems intact. Once demobilization began, once American divisions sailed west, once occupation replaced maneuver, the balance would harden irreversibly. He did not claim the Soviets intended immediate war. He argued something more precise, that Soviet power, once consolidated, would become immune to Western pressure. The preparation he demanded reflected this logic. He instructed planners to discard assumptions of continued cooperation. Soviet forces were to be treated as a potential adversary with full operational capability. Planning was to assume no internal collapse, no popular uprisings, no negotiated withdrawals. The Red Army was to be assessed at maximum effectiveness. Anything less, Churchill warned, would be self-deception. His insistence on rearming German units followed the same reasoning. It was not motivated by reconciliation or pragmatism alone, but by time compression. Training new formations was impossible. Expanding Allied manpower was unrealistic. The only immediately available reservoir of experienced soldiers familiar with Eastern Front warfare already existed under Allied guard. Churchill viewed this not as a moral dilemma, but as a technical one. The German army had been defeated, but it had not been erased. Its knowledge remained usable. Churchill also anticipated the objections. He understood that casualty projections would be severe, that public tolerance for another war was non-existent, and that American support could not be assumed. He prepared for this by separating planning from advocacy. The chiefs of staff were not asked to endorse the operation politically. They were instructed to test it militarily. If it failed under scrutiny, that failure itself would define Britain's limits in the post-war world. The warning extended beyond Poland. Churchill believed that a failure to confront Soviet expansion in 1945 would commit Western Europe to permanent strategic inferiority. He anticipated a divided continent not because it was inevitable, but because it would be accepted by default. The purpose of preparation was to prevent passive acquiescence masquerading as peace. What gave his warning weight was his record. He had been wrong before, but he had also been right when consensus lagged behind reality. He had warned against German rearmament in the 1930s. He had warned against the speed of France's collapse. He had warned against underestimating the scale of total war. In each case, delay had magnified cost. Operation Unthinkable was framed internally as the last moment when delay might still be reversible. Churchill did not promise success. He promised clarity. He wanted to know, definitively, whether force could still be used as a bargaining instrument or whether Britain had already crossed the threshold into strategic impotence. The preparation he demanded was exhaustive precisely because he expected the answer to be unwelcome. As the Joint Planning Staff assembled data, Churchill monitored progress closely but did not interfere with conclusions. He read drafts. He questioned assumptions. He pressed for worst-case analysis rather than optimistic modeling. His warning was not that the Soviets would attack tomorrow. It was that tomorrow would remove all remaining options. By the end of May, the warning had been translated into charts, tables, and projections. It was no longer rhetorical. It was mathematical. The numbers did not flatter his position, but they validated his premise. Time, not intention, was the decisive factor. And time was running out. The plan did not fail because it was misunderstood. It failed because the system around it functioned exactly as designed. Once Operation Unthinkable moved from Churchill's desk into the machinery of alliance politics, its fate was effectively sealed. The first constraint was American. Franklin Roosevelt was dead, and his successor inherited authority without experience or political capital. Harry Truman's priority was not leverage in Eastern Europe, but stability. He faced an electorate exhausted by war, a military preparing for the invasion of Japan, and advisors who warned against any action that could fracture the wartime coalition before peace was formalized. An offensive against the Soviet Union, launched weeks after victory in Europe, threatened all three. American military leadership reinforced this caution. Senior commanders understood the numbers without needing persuasion. They had watched Soviet armies absorb losses on a scale no Western force could replicate. They had coordinated with Red Army staffs long enough to know their operational resilience. From their perspective, initiating conflict was not boldness. It was strategic self-harm. Cooperation with Britain depended on consensus, and consensus did not exist. Within Britain, resistance was quieter but no less decisive. The chiefs of staff did not dispute Churchill's assessment of Soviet ambition. They disputed the assumption that military force could meaningfully alter it. Their reports emphasized material imbalance, extended supply lines, and the impossibility of sustaining public support. These were not political objections in disguise. They were institutional filters designed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. The proposal to rearm German soldiers became the fulcrum of opposition. Militarily, planners acknowledged its limited utility. Politically, it was radioactive. Britain had spent 6 years framing the war as a moral struggle against German militarism. To reverse that narrative overnight, without warning, would invite domestic backlash and international outrage. The government could not plausibly justify placing British soldiers alongside men who had recently been enemies, regardless of their utility against the Soviets. Alliance mechanics compounded the paralysis. Any operation of this scale required American participation. Any American participation required presidential approval. Any approval required political justification that could survive congressional scrutiny and public exposure. Operation Unthinkable could survive as a classified planning exercise, but not as policy. The moment it crossed that boundary, it would collapse under its own contradictions. Churchill encountered these barriers sequentially and recognized them for what they were. Not cowardice, not betrayal, structural resistance. The very system he had helped build to win the war now prevented him from shaping the peace through force. Coalition warfare had required compromise, shared authority, and deference to political consensus. Those same mechanisms now neutralized unilateral initiative. Even within the War Office, momentum slowed. Planning continued, but its character changed. Emphasis shifted from execution to assessment, from preparation to documentation. Contingencies multiplied. Assumptions were stress-tested to failure. Each iteration produced the same conclusion. Without overwhelming American commitment, the plan was unworkable. With it, the political cost was prohibitive. Churchill pressed where he could, but he did not break the system. He understood its limits too well. He had relied on those limits to restrain other commanders, other ambitions, earlier in the war. Now they constrained him. The institutional caution he had once defended became the barrier he could not breach. By late May, the overrule was implicit rather than explicit. No single order canceled Operation Unthinkable. No vote rejected it. It simply lost oxygen. Files were completed, stamped, and classified. Discussions narrowed. The target date remained on paper, but no force moved toward it. Planning existed without intent. The decision had been made in reverse. The system had spoken without speaking. Military logic had been heard, measured, and then subordinated to alliance preservation, political stability, and fear of uncontrollable escalation. Operation Unthinkable was not defeated by argument. It was absorbed and neutralized by process. Churchill remained prime minister for weeks afterward, publicly celebrating unity while privately accepting constraint. The overrule was complete, not because anyone said no, but because no one said yes. The consequences of Churchill's order unfolded without a single shot being fired, yet they were no less concrete for their silence. Once Operation Unthinkable entered the planning system, it began to generate effects that reshaped Allied behavior even as the plan itself stalled. The most immediate consequence was clarity. The Joint Planning Staff simulations removed any remaining ambiguity about the military balance in Europe. Their projections showed that a Western offensive, even if initially successful, would likely trigger a Soviet counteroffensive of overwhelming scale. The Red Army's depth meant that losses at the front would not translate into strategic paralysis. Soviet reserves could be shifted west faster than Allied forces could be reinforced. A failed advance would not merely stall. It would reverse violently. This assessment forced Allied commanders to confront a scenario they had not previously formalized: the vulnerability of Western Europe itself. The same models that examined an Allied attack also evaluated the consequences of failure. They showed Soviet forces capable of advancing to the Rhine if momentum broke. Supply depots, ports, and airfields painstakingly built since Normandy could be lost in weeks. Political control over liberated countries could collapse just as quickly. These conclusions altered posture. Even without execution, the planning for Operation Unthinkable sharpened defensive awareness. Western forces began thinking less like victors consolidating peace and more like custodians guarding against reversal. Occupation plans quietly incorporated contingency thinking. Forced deployments were reconsidered. Air power allocations emphasized readiness rather than drawdown. The German rearmament proposal produced its own consequences, despite never being implemented. It forced Allied leadership to acknowledge a practical truth they preferred to avoid. German military expertise remained one of the few factors capable of complicating Soviet operations in Central Europe. Though politically unacceptable, the idea lingered as an unspoken variable. German officers were interrogated more thoroughly. Soviet tactics were studied through German experience. Knowledge extracted without formal rearmament still flowed into Western analysis. For Churchill personally, the consequences were isolating. He had forced the question of confrontation into the open, only to discover that Britain lacked the means to answer it alone. His authority could initiate planning but not compel alignment. The gap between British strategic anxiety and American strategic patience widened. Britain remained influential, but it was no longer decisive. On the American side, Operation Unthinkable reinforced a different conclusion. U.S. leadership recognized that direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union was untenable in 1945, but postponement did not mean trust. American planners absorbed the British warnings even as they rejected British urgency. The result was a shift toward long-term containment thinking, though it would not yet be named as such. The absence of action itself became consequential. By not moving, the Western Allies implicitly accepted the new territorial reality. Soviet control of Eastern Europe hardened rapidly. Security services were installed. Political parties were neutralized or absorbed. Borders that might once have been negotiable became fixed through presence rather than agreement. What had been a temporary wartime occupation transformed into a permanent strategic buffer. This transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over months, then years. But the planning documents of Operation Unthinkable record the moment when Western leadership recognized the process as irreversible by force. The consequence was a shift from intervention to accommodation, not out of goodwill, but out of constraint. For the Red Army, the consequence was confidence. Though unaware of the specifics, Soviet leadership correctly sensed that no immediate Western challenge was coming. Demobilization proceeded on Soviet terms. Eastern European states were reorganized without fear of Allied interference. The absence of resistance was interpreted not as restraint, but as acceptance. Within Britain, the political costs surfaced soon after. Churchill lost the general election in July 1945. His warnings about Soviet expansion did not resonate with a public exhausted by war and focused on reconstruction. The planning for Operation Unthinkable, classified and unknown, could not be used to justify his stance. He left office without having acted on his final strategic instinct. Yet the military consequences persisted. British defense planning quietly reoriented toward the possibility of future conflict with the Soviet Union. Force structures were reconsidered. Intelligence priorities shifted eastward. The enemy had changed, even if the alliance had not yet publicly fractured. The most enduring consequence was conceptual. Operation Unthinkable demonstrated the limits of victory. It showed that defeating a common enemy did not guarantee control over the peace that followed. Military power, once expended, could not be instantly regenerated for a new purpose. Coalitions could win wars without agreeing on outcomes. The battlefield, though never engaged, left its mark. The imagined casualty lists, the projected retreats, the modeled collapses all informed behavior. Leaders who had seen those projections did not forget them. Decisions taken later, from forced deployments to diplomatic concessions, bore the imprint of what had been calculated and rejected. In this sense, Operation Unthinkable succeeded in one respect. It forced a reckoning. It made explicit the cost of confrontation and the cost of restraint. The Western Allies chose restraint, not because it was preferable, but because the alternative was unmanageable. The war against Germany ended with surrender. The war Churchill feared did not begin with declaration or attack. It began with silence, consolidation, and the slow division of Europe. That outcome was not accidental. It flowed directly from the consequences of a decision that reached the edge of execution and then stopped. By the time the planning files were sealed, the immediate danger had passed, but the strategic landscape had been transformed. Europe entered a long standoff shaped not by what was done, but by what had been calculated and deliberately not attempted. By the time Operation Unthinkable entered the historical record, its relevance no longer depended on whether it could have worked. What mattered was what it revealed about the closing weeks of the war and the shape of the peace that followed. For decades, the plan remained buried. British officials denied its existence, and memoirs avoided its implications. Only with declassification in the late 1990s did the scope of Churchill's directive become visible. The documents showed that this was not a marginal staff exercise or a speculative memorandum. It was a fully developed operational plan with force allocations, timelines, and casualty projections. The files left no ambiguity about intent. Post-war analysis confirmed what the planners had already concluded in 1945. The Western Allies lacked the manpower, armor density, and strategic depth required to defeat the Soviet Union in Europe. Even optimistic projections assumed rapid Soviet recovery and escalation. The imbalance was structural, not circumstantial. Victory over Germany had exhausted Western capacity at the precise moment Soviet capacity peaked. Memoirs from British and American commanders reinforced this assessment. None suggested the plan had been quietly viable. Several acknowledged that Churchill's fears about Soviet intentions were justified, but they separated diagnosis from remedy. Force, they agreed, was not available in usable quantity. The choice was not between confrontation and peace, but between delayed confrontation and immediate disaster. The archival record also clarified the German rearmament proposal. It was discussed seriously, costed precisely, and rejected decisively. Not because it violated wartime rhetoric, but because it failed to close the decisive gap. 100,000 German soldiers could complicate Soviet operations. They could not reverse a continental imbalance. The documents described this option as a force multiplier with diminishing returns, not a solution. Hindsight further stripped the plan of illusion. The Soviet consolidation of Eastern Europe proceeded exactly as Churchill feared. Poland's promised elections were managed. Opposition movements were neutralized. Borders solidified under occupation rather than agreement. These outcomes validated his assessment of Soviet intent, but not his belief that force could still alter it in 1945. Operation Unthinkable thus occupies an unusual place in the post-war record. It stands as proof that Western leaders recognized the coming division of Europe before it was publicly acknowledged. It also demonstrates that recognition did not equate to capability. Awareness arrived after exhaustion, not before. The plan influenced behavior indirectly. American and British defense planning in the late 1940s reflected lessons drawn from its failure. The emphasis shifted to long-term deterrence, forward defense, and alliance structures designed to prevent rather than reverse Soviet expansion. The North Atlantic Treaty was not conceived in isolation. It emerged from the same recognition that unilateral action was impossible. Churchill himself referenced these tensions obliquely after leaving office. His later speeches warned of division, not attack. The language hardened, but the means softened. What he had sought through force in 1945, he later pursued through alignment and warning. The difference was not conviction. It was constraint. The post-war record closes the case without ambiguity. Operation Unthinkable was real. It was deliberate. It was examined rigorously and abandoned rationally. It did not fail through indecision or secrecy, but through arithmetic. The balance of power made execution impossible without catastrophic risk. In retrospect, the plan marks the true end of the Second World War at the strategic level. The fighting stopped in May, but the reckoning did not. Victory did not resolve the central question of power in Europe. It postponed it. Operation Unthinkable captured the moment when that postponement became permanent. What followed was not peace in the traditional sense, but stabilization under tension. The plan's legacy lies not in action taken, but in boundaries recognized. It defined the limits of Western influence at the moment of maximum exhaustion and documented the price of having arrived there too late to shape the peace by force. The files were sealed, then opened. Their contents did not shock historians because of what they proposed, but because of what they confirmed. The war ended with one enemy defeated and another already beyond reach. The record leaves no room for alternative interpretation. The decision was explored. The cost was calculated. The option was closed. Operation Unthinkable ends without ambiguity. The order was issued. The planning was completed. The calculations were finished. The result was definitive. Churchill identified the threat correctly. He understood that Soviet power, once consolidated, would not retreat voluntarily. He recognized that Poland and Eastern Europe would be decided by presence, not promises. On that assessment, history confirmed him. Where the record closes against him is capability. Britain did not possess the means to act alone. The Western Allies, victorious but exhausted, had spent their power defeating Germany. There was no reserve left for coercing a former ally whose strength was at its peak. The balance was not temporary. It was structural. Operation Unthinkable demonstrated the final limit of wartime leadership. Decisions could still be imagined. They could still be planned, but they could no longer be imposed. Coalition warfare had delivered victory at the cost of autonomy. The system that had won the war now prevented its architects from dictating the peace. No battle followed. No declaration was issued. Yet the outcome was decisive. By not acting, the Western Allies accepted a divided continent. That division was not declared. It emerged from inertia, exhaustion, and arithmetic. It hardened without resistance because resistance was no longer viable. Churchill left office weeks later. The public never knew how close Europe had come to another war. The files were sealed. The silence held. But the consequences unfolded exactly as the planners feared. Eastern Europe fell behind a barrier that would last generations. Operation Unthinkable was not a failure of nerve. It was a confrontation with reality. The plan proved that recognition does not equal power, and that victory does not guarantee control over what follows. The case is closed. The decision was made. The option was tested. The limits were exposed. History moved forward not by action, but by restraint forced by exhaustion. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped wars after the fighting stopped, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below.